Well, it is 4:30 and time to go live for our discussion of Infinite Insights, book number 2. Just as a legal notice, this is fair use for instructional and teaching of the material contained within the copyrighted book by Mr. Parker. With that, let's get started. On the right here of your screen, you will see the organizational chart on blocks found in Infinite Insights Book 2. This, as Mr. Cole would say, scared the living daylights out of him when looking through Infinite Insights, all these charts. And this is actually a relatively simple one compared to, especially once you start looking at the charts on foot maneuvers and stance changes, and then you go into actual strikes. And they become quite larger than what we have here. But once you have the syllabus, the 154 self-defense techniques, 96 extensions, and the forms and the sets, it begins to start making sense. You begin to, especially as guys, begin to put each of these into their own block. If you guys can see my cursor over here, my mouse. Well, Mr. Cole just texts and says he's not a part of this group. I'm going to have to add him as a part of this group so that he can see. There we go. See the rest of our video. With that, we'll continue on. With each of these boxes, we can add sub-boxes and talk about how it relates to the actual system. In other words, blocks are a subset of not only striking, but parrying, positioned or learning positions of the body, position recognition, pinning, and specialized movements, both hand and arm and foot and leg techniques that can be then interpreted as blocks. It's not quite scary, maybe because it's a vertical alignment rather than a horizontal alignment. It might be not as scary if it were a organizational chart like you would see in a business. But I digress and we move on. The most important thing, as we're going to be looking at, not only is Mr. Parker's own words about his system and how he viewed blocking, but is in the illustrations and the pictures that were taken specifically and reviewed by Mr. Parker and Edmund on the physical dimensions, height, width, and depth of each of these blocks. And in our discussion, hopefully you guys can get in on this, is on looking at our bodies as both height, width, and depth in every action we do. That we're no longer just almost a two-dimensional being, that in Kenpo we actually go into 3 dimensions, and looking at especially the crazy chart in book 3 where Edmund drew basically Da Vinci's man, but on planes both vertically and horizontally, in which you could see the length and ranges of the arms both forward and backward, where you could see how high the arm could reach above, or even the legs themselves as well. This brings depth into what we do, rather than, unfortunately, a lot of 2D Kenpo that we see all over the place. And we'll get into that as we get into the material. Here we go. Book 2, I don't know what actual page this is because, unfortunately, this is a Kindle version of the book and it doesn't have the proper corresponding page numbers. So we're going to start looking at striking blocks, specifically the inward block. Here we come to our first page, and hopefully you guys can see this. At least for me, it looks like it's coming up blurry. And the inward block is a striking block. And there's two versions of the inward block. Mr. Parker described them as hammering and thrusting. Hammering inward blocks teach the beginner how to derive power from an indirect and an ideal position. The hammering inward always finds its point of origin wherever it is. The same thing can be said of the thrusting inward, but especially the hammering inward becomes more of a strike than a block. But as we're going to go through the rest of this chapter here in Infinite Insights Chapter 2, we see that Mr. Parker goes into the discussion of height, width, and depth by using what we would call the conceptual box. The model being used is Mr. Trejo, as we're going to see him demonstrating ideal phase, horse stance basics blocks, not looking at it from a neutral bow or even a sitting position like I'm sitting now. The size of the square box, the conceptual box as it's called later, is the width of your shoulders. Now, one of the biggest things we see in videos online and everywhere is that I don't think this is being used as a tool to teach blocking set 1, as a tool to teach height, width, and depth of each of the blocks. We see here Mr. Trejo in a training horse position. A nice, beautiful training horse position. But especially for our kids and younger folks, what I like to do is either sit them down on the ground, crisscross applesauce, or sitting in a chair like I am now, where the lower half is immobile and we can focus on the body dynamics and the proper dimensions for this blocking set. We notice here that the horizontal lines are placed from Mr. Trejo's shoulders out, and we notice that each line is equal to the width of your shoulders, which includes the distance from my shoulders to the corner of the boxes. In my particular case, let me move the camera over a little bit. That should be better. In my particular case, my arm is about the same length as the width of my shoulders, except for I have to take my hands off. So what I do with our kids, if I don't have sticks around, is I have them place their hands out shoulder width apart, and I have them flap their hands in. Those are the corners where my hand makes this 90-degree angle, is the corner of the conceptual box, which is seen here in illustration B of Frank Trejo's conceptual box. It's important that we realize, especially for those of you that are instructors, that this distance is different for everyone. Not everyone has the length of arms that I do. I cannot impose my conceptual box upon their body frame. This is what I would call true tailoring. Not fixing the art to fit a student, but instead making sure it is the right height, width, and depth of action for that student. So we notice here the first set of corners for the conceptual box, and this will end up actually becoming a cube, and then later on a rectangle, or even a parallelogram later on in the illustrations. Let us move on. The first block we're going to talk about is a hammering inward block. Hammering inward, in this particular illustration, in the ideal phase, in the beginning instructional phase, starts from a cocked and locked position. You've got to start somewhere, right? Except for one of the great ways that we that I use to teach the hammering inward block is I teach that short form 1 has 2 types of blocks to start off with. The first 2 sets of movements in short form 1 from the Kenpo hand's position. The first one is to drop the right hand into a right hammering inward block, and then your left hand comes to a chambered position ready for then the thrusting inward block, which is the second block of the form. Once again, we notice this is a point of origin. I'm not cocking and blocking. It's already in essence cocked, much like when I carry a pistol here in South Dakota. I have a round in the chamber. It is cocked and locked and ready to go, just as I am here in the Kenpo hand's position at the beginning of short form 1 to just drop the hammer, hence hammering inward block, for the first move of short form 1. Once again, here, Mr. Trejo is showing the ideal phase position of the hand in instructing the hammering inward block. Now, I personally believe that he's showing in this image 3A this almost vertical outward, extended outward position. Although it's compressed, he's not going beyond the boundaries of his shoulders. Notice here, it almost looks like my arm's detached from my body, but I've gone beyond the plane of my right shoulder. Here, Mr. Trejo is sure to show that his arm, or especially his hand, is within the conceptual box from both the start to finish of the block. A lot of this also has to do with later, as we will talk about inner rim and outer rim. Inner rim, outer perimeter, as we discuss how the elbow functions as an anchor within the universal pattern, as it functions within blocking set 1. But here, this is an ideal phase illustration of the hammering block. Notice here, they show a neutral bow position for the hammering inward. Now, you notice here, as Mr. Parker takes note, that the elbows are anchored. How many times have we seen an hammering inward block that is done like this? As though literally the arm is the shaft of the hammer, the fist is the head, and they're going to pound the person into submission. But what's the problem with this position? It makes me use smaller group muscles in my shoulder and the deltoids to create force downward pressure. Versus, as Mr. Trejo is showing here, from the cocked and locked position inside of his conceptual box, it is just a rotation of the body that is the initialization of the block, and then he drops the hammer. Notice there, I use body fusion between my bicep and my pec to be the catalyst for the motion of this block. As my left shoulder rotates, the body, my arm and shoulder stays consistent, moves with the block, and then at the moment of impact, I drop the hammer. I rotate and drop the hammer. Notice once again, I'm not going beyond my own personal conceptual box and using the fleshy part of the fist. You want to talk about margin for error. Mr. Parker talks about that in the next page. Mr. Parker writes here, notice the importance of anchoring elbows cannot be overemphasized. It gives you greater protection because it allows you a margin for error. Now, initially, when we go through blocking set 1, we look at the fact that blocking set 1 is an introduction into more sophisticated blocking motions later on. Parries, presses, checks. But we initially teach that the margin for error on, for instance, a hammering or thrusting inward block is from the end of my fist to my elbow. And yet, once we get the basic motions, we've gone through our horse stance training, we actually see in the techniques that if we're talking about the arm from the elbow to the fist being a hammer, what is the effective portion of that arm? These last 3 inches. So when I'm doing a technique like delayed sword, am I going to be using my entire arm like the squeegee motion coming from an upward block to a hammering inward block? Am I going to be using this whole margin for error? No. I'm going to be using these 3 little inches at the end of my fist in order to execute that hammering inward block. Once again, we notice here the use of the diagrams to discuss changes in depth based upon target and environment. Here, specifically, the environment in which Mr. Trejo's found himself, the weapon in which he is using is a bladed knife. He wants to use that to its maximum ability and not go beyond, notice here, his conceptual box, but still be able to use the weapon effectively. What does that tell him to do? It tells him to anchor his elbow more towards the center line of his body and be able to use the articulation in his wrists to trap or to fillet the weapon coming at him. We see these in Mr. Parker's expanded notes that Edmund had released on the internet some years back in discussing the variableness of the knife and the weapon depending upon what type of weapon. It's different for my pocket knife than with a karambit or with, as is seen here, Mr. Trejo having one of the Kenpo knives. The depth of action is different. Oh, heaven forbid. Chris, did you just say that the executing a hammering or thrusting inward block sometimes can require an understanding of depth of action? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Not to be sarcastic, but it's certainly true. If we look at the hammering inward, especially from a neutral bow, requires an understanding of both vertical and horizontal zones of action within our body, as found in Infinite Insights. We can see the illustrations, the Venetian blind principle that Edmund drew of using depth to our advantage. That's why the yellow belt saying keeps coming up, that make space, make distance your friend. That doesn't just mean go away from the target. It can mean the space in between you and your opponent then becomes your ally. If you understand depth of action between a hammering inward in short form 1 or whether it be delayed sword, requires an understanding of variables of depth of action. Sounds like I'm preaching here, but it kind of comes out. The thrusting inward block is a little bit different animal. The thrusting inward block predominantly finds its point of origin from cocked positions, whether it be from a form or from our self-defense techniques. Now, if we are sparring, and I want to use the thrusting inward block as we're going to use. Let me step back and stand up in a neutral bow and see if we can do this. Let me push the camera up a little bit. Is that better? Yeah. I'm in a left neutral bow facing the camera. If my hands are here, is not effectively my point of origin for my left arm a thrusting inward position. It is at the end of the conceptual box. I'm not going beyond my conceptual box. It's within the conceptual box motion. My hand is already effectively in a thrusting inward position without the essential thrust behind it. In other words, as I'm here, for instance, if I do an up-clock maneuver, I have my thrusting inward motion with just a travel of 2 or 3 inches. Rather than having it from a cocked position in a neutral bow and thrusting the block out there, instead, I've already pre-positioned, this is my point of origin, to point of contact, to point of penetration, contact manipulation, and then we continue in whatever technique or sparring situation that we are in. Once again, point of origin becomes point of contact. Point of origin to point of contact usually involves bridging the gap between you and your opponent and bridging the gap in your own body mechanics. In other words, once again, here I am in left neutral bow to 12. Point of origin is only a few inches away from its target. That is my depth of action. Depth of action becomes depth of penetration, contact manipulation, contact penetration, then contact manipulation. Oh, look at, here we go. Marcus Moore is here. I just saw it. Yes, Mr. Cole is right. He talks about method of hammering being a path of action when blocking and a path of attack when striking. In order to really understand that is going beyond the scope of this video, but as we talk about paths and lines, as we're looking at blocking set 1, when I go from an upward block to the hammering inward block, we see that this is a path of action. In the universal pattern, I'm going from one corner of the diamond to the other corner of the diamond in a swath. This is a path of action. We see that hammering, especially in the hammering inward, can become an attack, and it actually becomes a path of attack. Much as though we see in Mace of Aggression. Mace of Aggression becomes after the initial hammer strike to the jaw. As our hand comes down and either strikes or pushes on the opponent's right arm to feed into the elbow, that is a path of attack. Not just a path of action, it's an actual attack on the joint, versus we see in blocks, predominantly we see paths of action rather than lines of action or paths of attack. On to the thrusting inward block. Sorry I missed your guys' comments earlier. Hopefully you guys are still watching. Wave if you, say hi if you guys are still watching. Just as a reminder, folks, it takes about 3 to 5 seconds for your comments to catch up to me and for me to be able to respond to them on Facebook from the time I'm streaming. Well, no one said hi yet. Maybe you guys already took off on me. Well, it says 3 are viewing. Well, let's continue in talking about the thrusting inward block, since it's already been 37 minutes on the hammering inward block and blocks in general. Well, now we're down to 2. I scared someone off. Thrusting inward block. You're to start your action from the position your hand is in at the time. Once again, you are to start your action, the block, from the position your hand is in at the time. Point of origin. I know Dr. Dave Crouch is huge on point of origin, point of contact, point of penetration. And I will borrow that from Dr. Dave. With the thrusting inward block, as we talked about in sparring, and in the position I was in, from position recognition, I notice that the block, in this case the action, started from this point. From my on guard or hands ready position, I was basically already in a thrusting inward position, using position recognition to find that which we're doing. Hey, Mr. Cole's on there. The hammering portion of the hammering inward block is the fist that makes contact as the action ends. Mr. Parker is being very clear here, and I don't know why. As I talk to a lot of Kenpoists, they may have said that they've read Infinite Insights maybe once or glanced through them, but for all intents and purposes, the Infinite Insights series and the encyclopedia are our Bible, in the sense of it provides rules and a guide for understanding what it is that we are doing. You know, we stand upon the shoulders of giants. Not only Mr. Parker, but those that came before him. Both the Japanese and Chinese and Hawaiian influences that came into American Kenpo, Mr. Parker digested and thought about and organized into the system in which we study today. Notice there, the hammer portion of the fist makes contact as the action ends. In other words, this is your margin for error. Those 3 inches. Not the 18 to 24 inches that your elbow to your fist is. No, instead it is the 3 inches at the end of your fist. Once again, showing the ideal phase, the training horse basic for the thrusting inward, we see from your traditional hands cocked and locked position at either the belt or in a high chambered position near the pecs. We see that the hand comes up and into a thrusting motion to the corner of Mr. Trejo's conceptual box. We see this motion, him being able to use this as though it were a knife edge. In other words, if I were to grab my knife and have it to be my margin for error, as I come up from my cocked position, I'm going to lead blade side forward as I continue and end the motion. Notice here my elbow is anchored towards my body. One of the things we do see in American Kenpo, or Kenpo in general, is that sometimes the thrusting inward block will become this. It'll become flattened out to where they're aiming with this, but they've lost contact. They've lost body fusion. They've lost the anchored elbow, which gives you your inner rim, in order to have body mass, body alignment behind the strike, behind the block in this case. Let's continue. Notice here, Mr. Trejo is now in a right neutral bow. Notice here that he's still looking at a conceptual box. His conceptual box has not changed. The depth in which his action should be within has not changed. Now, I personally would move this corner where his fist is back where his shoulder is, and that his now right fist would be touching this left front corner of the conceptual box. In other words, I view the conceptual box as going with you and stationary with your body as you're going through motion, especially as he goes here from a training horse to a left neutral bow. Now, you may be asking yourself, how did he do that? Good question. For that answer, look at Mr. Cole's YouTube page and look at how to step back naturally. By this line or this arrow, you would think as though Mr. Trejo had used the gate to open up his stance. In other words, he just swung his foot back. That's not what we see in techniques. Unfortunately, we do see those techniques all over the internet. We see people use swinging the gate, which then puts them as their foot is totally off of the ground, and then have to replace their foot on the ground. In that moment, is there any structure behind their block? I'll let that sink in for a minute. As their left foot is up in the air, if they are to just swing the gate, is there any structural integrity for their block? No, there's not. There's not structural integrity for their block. So I encourage you guys, I will post a link to Mr. Cole's YouTube page to take a look at how to step back naturally in the overcorrect neutral bow and seeing how that affects the conceptual box and your blocking motions in general. Now we move on to outward blocks. And today I didn't want to cover the vertical outward until we move on to using vertical outwards as moving blocks and as positional checks. But I wanted to look at the extended outward block. Notice as we are looking at earlier, Mr. Trejo, when starting his hammering inward block, his cocked position was basically an extended outward position where his fist was within his conceptual box and then hammered to the opposite corner, caddy corner of his conceptual box. We're going to take that same idea, and now instead of it being compressed to his body, we're going to use expansion to show depth of action within our extended outward blocks. Here's him showing the vertical outward and anatomy. Here's the extended outward, once again from the training horse and showing an ideal phase, blocking set basic of going from a cup and saucer position on the opposite side to the vertical extended outward position. You notice here, Mr. Trejo does not go beyond the conceptual box of the edge of his shoulder. As I teach children and adults to do blocking set, and specifically the vertical outward block, I have them go up against a wall, have a wall on either side of their body in which they cannot go beyond unless they push themselves away from the wall. So for instance, if I were to practice or to illustrate the vertical extended outward position, I would stand with my right foot against the baseboard of the wall, my right shoulder barely touching the wall in a nice neutral position, in which I would then have them start from either the collapsed position or starting from the traditional cup and saucer position. But it teaches them to stop at the border of the shoulder found in the conceptual box. One of the things we see within Kenpo all over the place, or in martial arts in general, if they have this type of block, what happens is that they get beyond their conceptual box. They disconnect their arm from their body, in essence, and have it beyond body alignment, body fusion, backup mass. And instead, the extended outward position becomes this. Once again, what have I created here? If we were to be able to draw 3 lines in my body, there's a line just on the outside, as we see at the edge of your screen. There's a line right here at my elbow. That is one depth of action. From my elbow to my shoulder is another depth of action. From my shoulder to the side of my face is another depth. Basically, I have expanded the Venetian blind to where I am beyond my conceptual box. My conceptual box ends here at my shoulder. I am a good 1.5 zones beyond my conceptual box. So I must bring it in to my own anatomy, my own conceptual box, in order to maintain body fusion, body alignment, backup mass, all of the things in which give our blocks and our strikes power and the ability to stop the incoming attack in which we ask it to. The big problem is, because we train with the extended outward so far out here, when I do something like shielding hammer, what's going to happen? Well, number one, what is my margin for error? According to what has been taught, or what is seen and taught, is the entire surface area of my arm, from my elbow to my fist. And yet, if you were to look at shielding hammer, for instance, as we step back with that extended outward position, if I am to use my entire margin for error, I have to reach beyond my conceptual box. I'm going to turn sideways here for a moment to give an illustration and back up a little bit. Once again, here's my personal conceptual box. This is the extent of my conceptual box. If I were to step back into a left neutral bow and throw an extended outward block as I would for shielding hammer, it ends at my conceptual box. But what we see in American Kenpo, predominantly, I would say in 90% of the videos, is not only is it outside, but is also forward. Everybody's reaching for their targets because why? Because they haven't learned the difference between now and when then. That's a topic for another day, but please look in Postmodern Kenpo for Mr. Cole's articles on now and when then. But basically all now attacks are knives, clubs, guns, kicks, punches. Knives, clubs, guns, punches, and kicks are now attacks. When they move, I move. The big problem with everybody reaching beyond their conceptual box and shielding hammer is that they either stepped back too far or used a push drag to go beyond within contact of their opponent, and so they have to reach to get him. Or they responded too late and they're either hitting at the bicep, hitting here, and then the arm will just collapse in on them. It's a timing issue. That is why that's created, I think, in my opinion, this is Chris's opinion, take it for whatever it's worth, that we see the extended outward blocks going from an elbow tucked in position, fist about eye height, to instead almost being flat, almost what we could call a lowercase upward block position, in which their margin from error goes from a margin of error from here to here on a vertical plane to a margin of error on a horizontal plane. I don't know about you, but I think I would want the vertical plane rather than the horizontal plane. And Mr. Cole's reminding us that his YouTube account is Kenpo Geek on YouTube if you want to check it out. Also, there are articles on several different Facebook groups. If you want more information, please get a hold of Professor Cole. Once again, here is Mr. Trejo showing us depth of action in a neutral bow. Notice here in example 12A, the top box, Mr. Trejo is within his shoulder and the front line of his front foot. He doesn't go beyond the heel of his front foot. If we were to be able to place a line right here from his heel to his elbow, it would be parallel. They would be exactly matching. He would not be going beyond his conceptual box. He's staying within his own physical conceptual box motions. Once again, from the two different side views, we notice here that it is not a horizontal margin for error, but a vertical margin for error. He's not flattened out his margin for error as though he was striking sideways, in which we kind of see. Does this kind of remind you of the way you see people doing delayed sword? Yeah. We'll talk about that another time. But once again, his elbow is anchored. Let's talk about downward blocks for a few moments and the use of the conceptual box. Now, the traditional downward block, as I learned it 25 years ago, was to cock at the ear and to bring it down beyond your body. That once you made contact, you pushed beyond your body, in which your arm ended up almost going straight, almost hyperextending your elbow. Here we see the point of origin in your training horse downward blocks being shown from the cup and saucer position at the opposite side. There's nothing wrong with this in showing in an ideal phase instructional way the downward block. Now, we make a distinction in postmodern that this is a greater deflection block. In other words, you take a technique like deflecting hammer and use a greater deflection block. Where is his right foot going to go? I'll give you a few moments to think about that for a second. In deflecting hammer, after the push drag backwards, if we use a greater deflection block, either from cup and saucer position or cocked at the ear, as I strike, if we're using our fist as our margin for error, where is that right foot going to go? Somewhere between 430 and 3. What's the problem with our opponent landing with his right foot to 430, 3 to 430 on the clock? If you answered spinning, you were correct. Ding, 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 ding. What is your prize? Your prize is in knowing that you've done this for a while and know the effects of blocks on the body. So how do we remedy this? Do we lessen the force of a greater deflection downward block in order to prevent the spin? No. No. This is where a new descriptor or a new method of execution has to come out. This is why the position of vertical outward, extended outward, as I was here, becomes key. You notice as we do blocking set 1, 1, 2, 3. Now, 90% of Kenpo schools, let me back up for a moment, swing the arm directly from the extended outward block all the way down to a greater downward deflection block. Once again, this is that point of origin. I'll let that sink in for a moment. Is swinging the arm from basically 12 to 6 a viable point of origin? Some people claim that they train like they fight and they fight like they train. If that is true, once again, people say that they train like they fight and fight like they train. If we say that we have points of origin and we want a direct path of action or a direct line of action, is going from an vertical extended outward to greater deflection downward block a direct path or line of action? Nope. We've introduced an and in musical terms into the motion. It's 1 and 2. Once again, 1 and 2. I've introduced an and or a hiccup in people's motion. Aren't we supposed to be deleting hiccups, deleting constipated motion or inefficient motion from our vocabularies? Yeah, we have. We should be. So then why are we teaching our students or teaching each other or ourselves to introduce an and in the extended outward to greater deflection downward sequence in blocking set 1? I'll leave it to you guys to answer. What is it? Or does it make sense in using correct concepts and principles then to go from an extended outward position to dropping it and creating what we would call a lesser deflection downward block? This is something that we use in postmodern Kenpo for the block in deflecting hammer. Once again, this is me sitting in basically, without the use of my legs, a training horse position. If you're standing erect in a chair, as we sometimes teach our kids, or crisscross applesauce, this is a training horse position. But if we look at this from a neutral bow position, this is where I'm going to have a second camera to go from one to the other. But if I'm in a right neutral bow to the camera, correct depth of action, as I go from my extended outward position here, not going beyond my shoulder, if I go to the greater deflection downward block, I've introduced the and. In order to delete the and, let me go this other way. Once I've gone to the extended outward position, all I need to do the lesser deflection downward block is to drop my hand from my point of origin by my face to the target. Once again, using the margin of error of 3 inches on my fist, extended outward, using my elbow as a hinge. I have body fusion with my upper body between my pec and my bicep, and to just drop the hammer on either the ankle or the calf of the foot that's coming in. Now, if we're talking about the technique, and let me put the camera up a little bit. There we go. If we're talking about being nasty in our Kenpo and not having to subscribe to the basics, embryonics of what we were taught, if I were to have my hand open instead, here I'm in an extended outward position within the conceptual box. What if I were to drop my palm instead? What does that give me? What does this inverted position give me? Oh, hey, it's either called a gooseneck or a crane's head. What kind of goodness can we get from that? Well, instead of this position, big question is in deflecting hammer, what would the lesser deflection block do to the opponent's foot as I'm striking it? Where would that foot land? Let's make sure I didn't, yeah, I missed some. Huh, interesting. Hey, Mike, and hey there, Dr. Dave. Hey, Dr. Dave, were your ears burning or something? We were talking about you a little bit. But if I'm going to use a lesser deflection downward on deflecting hammer, if as I drop from this position onto the leg, where is his leg going to go? Is it going to go to the traditional 4:30 or 3 o'clock position? No. Most likely it's going to be driven back down into the ground. That will give me the time and position to then finish the technique, to use that push drag back into position, to use the pinning check, and the elbow. Once again, this is only possible because we're looking at deleting ends. We're looking at using the conceptual box based upon the dimensionality of my own body, the length of my arms, my height, my other roundness, in understanding where these blocks go. Once again, here we see the picture of Mr. Trejo in a neutral bow. I find these to be the most important, even more important than the training horse position pictures of these blocks. The reason why is if we were to divide this up into vertical dimensional zones using the Venetian blind principle, or some people call it the accordion principle, we see that he's not going beyond the natural length and arm of the body, and he's keeping his both his methods, but his big bug just hit in the window in my office, distracting me. June bugs, go away. His margin for error is what he's keeping, and keeping his arm within his conceptual box. Interesting story there, Dr. Dave. They're cardboard cutouts. End up having to reshoot pictures of different sequences. Always learning something new, especially for those of us that have come so many years later and not knowing some of this history. But unfortunately, a lot of that history is either not being carried on, or as we see, these concepts not being carried on, concepts and principles not being carried on to different lineages. It's just totally absent in most places. As I have discussions with people from all over the United States, from California to Florida to New York to Oregon, very few people have really looked at Infinite Insight series, studied it, asked questions. I'm hoping Postmodern Kenpo can be one of those groups in which asks these questions. Just as talking about in blocking set 1, why is there an and between the vertical extended outward position and the greater deflection downward block in blocking set 1? Aren't we supposed to delete motion and to create direct paths and lines of actions? To delete ands? Yeah, I think so. We're not going to cover the inside palm down and inside palm up positions within the conceptual box today, but we might cover that in another video. Once again, now in talking about the upward block, there's a famous seminar in which I know Mike has posted and I've seen online, and I think Mr. Parker is in either Santa Rosa or Santa Barbara, somewhere mid to northern California, doing a seminar in which he spends the span of 2 hours talking about basics in a room full of black belts. Wait a second, Chris, did you just say they were black belts? Yes, I'm saying they're black belts. In a room of 40 or 50 black belts, Mr. Parker's going over blocking set 1 and the basic embryonics of these blocks. And so what does he have to do? He has to grab a piece of paper to describe out and return motion in the upward block to a room full of black belts. Basically, this whole page here, illustrations 19 through 22, on this page, Mr. Parker's describing in the matter of, I think he spends 30 or 35 minutes on this singular motion. Now, the big question is are those that are at this seminar actually doing what Mr. Parker is asking him to do? Now, Mike has taught seminars, Dr. Dave has taught seminars, Professor Cole has taught seminars. How many of you see that the things in which you are trying to teach carry on to those at the seminar? Well, you probably hope that at least one person gets it. One person actually takes something that you're showing and applies it to their Kenpo. It's kind of like in my preaching here at the church. I'm praying and hoping that in my verse-by-verse study through the Bible, that it changes someone's life, that day, that 25 to 35 minutes in which I'm talking, changes one person's attitude or lifestyle or understanding. The same thing in Kenpo. My hope is that these videos and the videos that I will do later can help influence people to return back to Infinite Insights and take a look at this rationally and to think about their Kenpo rather than to think, oh, well, my instructor taught it this way, so then that just must be the standard. I want to help raise the standard of that which is called Kenpo. I know Mike does. I know Dr. Dave does. I know Professor Cole does. But I almost feel as though we're like Mr. Parker in the video of this seminar up in Northern California. He kept hitting the wall of 50 black belts in a room that even though he just spent 30 or 35 minutes explaining what to do, still did the block in the same way in which they were initially taught. In other words, they were doing the upward block the way I was taught 25 years ago, is from horse position, horse stance, you flap your arm up straight over your head so you get smacked in the top of the head. Mr. Parker is going, no. Depth of action, people. Out and return motion. So he takes the piece of paper, puts his fist right up to it, rotates his arm out, and shows the correct depth of action for the upward block. As we see here in illustration 21 A, B, C, and D, that Mr. Trejo is showing proper both vertical and horizontal depth of action with upward block. Now, quick question to the three of you that are watching. How many of you see this correct depth of action and out and return motion in upward blocks? I'm guessing probably not that often. And it's unfortunate, but true. I'm going to end here in about 10 minutes. Unfortunately, running out of time. Having so much fun and talking so much that we've been up for an hour and 15 minutes so far. But this upward block has to have depth of action. In other words, as I turn sideways, to show this depth of action, I go up the center line. As it reaches above my eye line, rotates. You notice here, I am seeing 3 different depths of action. My fist is in one vertical zone. From my wrist to my elbow is another vertical zone. And from my elbow to my shoulder is another vertical zone. Most often we see, how many vertical zones am I in? 1. There is no depth of action within this motion. If the guy has a knife or a club with a little bit of a puño to smack me around, I'm going to get hurt. I need depth of action to allow me to use this block effectively, especially in something like the circles of protection. In which we learn to use motion such as riding, with the motion to create something with even more depth of action. Now, yes, circles of protection is described of an upward, outward, overhead parry, but the basic concept comes here from the upward block. If students didn't get the depth of action in this upward block, then they are not going to get the concept of meeting the action here and riding the action in circles of protection. Yeah, right, Mike, not too often. So then how are we to teach our students if the embryonics are not there for the upward block? How are they to get the upward, outward, overhead parry in circles of protection that allows you to really smack your opponent? I have a funny story at the expense of Professor Cole. I hope he's still listening. I was at a seminar for now Master Rich Hale. And it was at Eric Kutagawa's place somewhere in LA. And he's hosting the seminar, and here I am, freshly in American Kenpo, maybe a year. And Mr. Hale asks Professor Cole to do circles of protection on him. So Mr. Hale puts a little bit of gusto behind the attack and comes over. Mr. Cole steps forward and does the exact motion that I'm talking about, meeting the force here, an upward, outward, overhead parry, which puts Mr. Hale right in the palm heel and whatever articulation of the hands we want to use for circles of protection. Mr. Cole actually smacks Mr. Hale And he all of a sudden is described to me as like, oh, you know what, the second he hit Mr. Hale, and then Buddy continues the technique, push the arm down, grabbing either the groin or the belt or the arm, and then finishing the technique. That created an interesting story in which we share to this day. In fact, those of us that were in line in the front row watching kind of reacted, both laughing and but also going, Mr. Cole's going to be dead by the end of the seminar because Mr. Hale's going to tear him a new one because he actually hit him. I'll read this comment by Mike Molina. Barbara, speaking of Barbara Hale, shared a story with me. She was asked to go back east and teach a seminar to the advanced black belts. She asked Mr. Parker, what would you like me to teach? He stated blocks and stances. She commented, are you sure? He said yes. That sounds about right from the stories I've heard from Darlene and others. And if you look at the documents that were released by Edmund, the unpublished notes, and you look at Mr. Parker's list of seminar topics, count how many of them have to do with basics and stances. I don't have the list in front of me, but I'm willing to bet it's a major percentage of the seminar topics in which he covered towards the end of his life. Now, I understand that Mr. Parker had people coming from Mr. Parker had to put money on the table, and he had people coming from other systems and other styles in which did not do the embryonic basics in the way which we did. So he had to catch people up to the way he wanted it done. Unfortunately, he didn't live life long enough to see that played out. Mike Molina made a comment. He says, after her return, speaking of Barbara Hale, Mr. Parker states, well, Barbara Hale states, you're right about blocks and stances. And there's no shortage of that today. I'm sure that if Mr. Hale was on here, he would comment about how many times he has to teach on yellow and orange belt techniques to a room full of black belts. My personal goal is to help change that climate and that atmosphere for those who want to really look at Infinite Insights as a guide to what we're doing. Now, is Infinite Insights in the encyclopedia everything? No. Mr. Parker didn't live long enough to really see his art expanded beyond what he was able to accomplish in his life. I'm sure that he wanted more for his art than what we see in 1990. So in order to do that, we have to be willing to evaluate what was given to us on a silver platter. Infinite Insights, the encyclopedia, the instructional manuals, and saying, where do we go from here? Well, that starts by talking to those that were around Mr. Hale, Darlene Parker, even Edmund Parker, Pat Solantri, and asking them the who, what, where, when, how, and why of what the art was and what it should have become. Unfortunately, because Kenpo is so fractured, now we are to the point in which we can't have as much of an influence on the art as we wish that we could have. Whether it's being part of certain associations or being able to do seminars to influence certain people, unfortunately, the community is so fractured that we can't accomplish everything that we would like to in the art. And you know what? That's okay. There's an old phrase that says you dance with those who want to dance. And that is my goal, is to have these videos reach those that want to look at the Infinite Insight series and to learn about what it is that we do. and to go from there, to bring everybody up, all the ships up to a singular level in which they're all floating and able to maneuver, and then teaching people how to drive the ship, how to get from point A to point B now that the tide has come in. Sounds like I'm preaching, and I kind of am, but that's okay. Back to the upward block. Once again, we look here at Mr. Trejo. I am seeing 3 vertical dimensional zones in his upward block. I see one here at his fist and his front hand and his front foot. From his wrist to his elbow as being number 2. From his elbow to his shoulder being number 3. And there's more both from his center line rearward as well. But the main ones I'm interested in right now are the 3 vertical dimensional zones showing in the front of his body. I wish I could see this in studios. You take something like circles protection, or you take something like dominating circles, or anything else that uses an upward block, and you insert it with this idea of depth of action, it would change the way Kenpo is done. Catch you later, Mike. Have a good time. Thanks for coming and watching. If we were to just take what we talked about here and implement it at, let's say, just every studio in Southern California, would that change Kenpo as we understand it? Oh, yeah. Or let's just take the middle states of America. If we were able to just influence from, let's say, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, over to Michigan, and then down to Alabama. If we were to take that middle section of America and be able to influence it with just the 4 blocks, major blocks that we looked at, would that change Kenpo? Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed our first video in a larger series, and I will have another camera and another screen up and running hopefully the next time with some more room and an actual body to do some of this stuff on. But if you guys like this series, if you guys would like to see more of this type of teaching and explanation and discussion, please like, please comment, please subscribe. This is going to be going out on not only Facebook, but on YouTube, so that people can get an understanding of what it is that we do. I've been your tour guide this afternoon, and you all have a good evening.